Now, an hour of clarity for exhausted people of our nation mired in toxic partisanship. Left versus right, us versus them. While we pay to keep our politicians fighting, how do we, the people, rise up and solve the great challenges of our time? We do it by embracing freedom and liberty. There may be no such thing as a free lunch, but this hour is as close as it gets. Welcome to A Free Solution.
All right, welcome to A Free Solution. I'm Kevin Wilson, your host for today. Thank you so much for joining us here on this wonderful, wonderful Monday. Appreciate you being here. If you're listening here on WYSL, or if you're listening to us over on WACK out in Newark, and of course, our friends listening online, A Free Solution, the Facebook page, A Free Solution YouTube channel, and the Kevin Wilson pages, wherever you're listening today. Thank you so much for being here. And today, I promised this a week ago. I wanted to do a deep dive into an actual policy issue. I want to do a deep dive into the infrastructure bill, right? We're going to be spending a $1.2 trillion. It looks like President Biden's going to be signing this into law. And $1.2 trillion, which, we've had in the last couple years, multiple bills where we're spending well over $1 trillion. It's like, imagine trying to explain this to the folks who are involved in the Tea Party movement back in 2010, that, I mean, it probably break a lot of our hearts back then, but we're spending an outrageous amount of money here. So we can hope that all of this money, all this that we're spending, it's actually going to do something good, that, it will fix the crumbling roads and bridges and, internet issues and whatever thing you want to project onto the infrastructure package. It's been politically popular to fix infrastructure across both parties. President Trump talked about it. Now President Biden's talking about it, and it's actually going to be law. We're actually committing ourselves to spending this money. Okay, so let's dive into it though. What the heck is actually in this thing? What is good, what is bad, what is ridiculous? And by the end of the show, I want to talk about some things that could make our infrastructure spending as is more effective, and then a few things that are a little bit more outside the box. What are different ways that we can approach infrastructure that maybe we're not doing now? Maybe some ways that go beyond the government, but still rely on like some government direction for roads and bridges and other pieces of infrastructure. So let's dive into what is in this bill. We're spending $1.2 trillion. Goodness, I hope it's something good. All right, so we'll start out with, main thing, banner issue, it's those roads and bridges, right? $110 billion for roads and bridges, other major infrastructure projects. They wanted more than that. They wanted $159 billion. They only got 110. $40 billion for bridge repair, replacement, rehabilitation. So there's a whole bunch there. I mean, the fact of the matter is there are a lot of bridges that are in rough shape. This is, in theory, supposed to go towards things that are needed, things that are necessary. Bill also has $16 billion for major projects that it just and I'm reading off of like there's like a nice like CNN like rundown of all the stuff in here, and it's a little bit editorialized, which kills me. I wanted to, like, it's the most succinct article that lists the most stuff in it, so I really like it for that. But they're like, oh well, stuff that wouldn't go toward that are too large or too complex for traditional funding programs, according to the White House. All right, so we're just kind of taking their word as is and running it for there. I mean, $16 billion for just other stuff that isn't normally funded. All right, yeah, that's great. And then the other part of this that made me say, like, hey, this is just kind of like repeating some propaganda system. 20% or 173,000 miles of our nation's highways and major roads are in poor condition, as are 45,000 bridges, according to the White House. So what's interesting about these numbers, right, is a lot of times like these come from like kind of civil engineering societies that like evaluate roadways, bridges, and whatnot. The problem is that they're not completely neutral in how they approach these issues, because they do have something on the line here, right? Like these these organizations, they're the ones who are planning out, building, and oftentimes, uh, getting money for these projects. So they're not completely neutral in the way that they approach these issues. There's a lot of incentive for public advocacy groups that have to do with infrastructure to emphasize that the roads and bridges are in worse condition than they in fact are. And they also emphasize traffic issues in many cases as well, because, well, again, it justifies further infrastructure investment. And I'm going to use kind of aggressive quotes. I hate I hate the word investment when it comes to government spending. Everyone wants to spin it as investment. It's not just spending. We're not just throwing in a pile and lighting it on fire. It's investment. So forgive me if I slip up and say that a couple times, but that's the language that our friends in Congress want to put around this stuff, and I don't always believe it. I'll put it that way. But anyway, when you look at these things that say like how poor roads and bridges and whatnot are in, it's a little bit spun. Just know that like that is partially true in many ways, and you can see it in the roads and bridges around us, but but it is not necessarily as true. It's not to you should take it a bit skeptically is all I'm saying here. All right. So there's a whole bunch in here too that talks about focus on climate change mitigation. Now I want to spend a good chunk of the part two of this show, segment two of the show, talking about that, because it's it's interesting how the Biden administration is approaching these things, because a lot of times it is things that sometimes coastal communities might need to do if sea levels rise in the way that climate change uh not advocates but people concerned about climate change say, right? I mean, the good news about the society that we live in, even if we do have climate change, there are ways to mitigate these things, but they're expensive, and not every local government either can or wants to pay for these things. So they are going to look more and more towards the federal government to pay for things like higher seawalls and different ways of redirecting water when you get a hurricane, and you get the storm surge that comes through, stuff like that. So there's a whole bunch of money for that type of stuff. See, $11 billion for transportation safety, and that's stuff to help states and localities reduce crashes and fatalities, especially cyclists and pedestrians. um, so again, I don't know what specifically that means. If they were making actual investments where like the structure of roads would change in a way that would make it less likely for folks to want to speed, to get in accidents. Now it's not always popular, but things like roundabouts can do that. Things like adding more trees to certain streets can do that. Encourage people to slow down. I don't know if it's going to be that stuff or if it's just going to be a bunch of nonsense. It's probably going to be a mix of both, to be honest. That's how it often is with these programs. Uh, uh, $1 billion to reconnect communities, and this is CNN's, mainly disproportionately black neighborhoods that are divided by highways and other infrastructure, according to White House. It will fund planning, design, demolition, reconstruction of street grids, parks, and other infrastructure. Now, what's interesting about this is like the U.S. government already funds this stuff, and has before, right? Like the Tiger funds that went into taking out that chunk of the inner loop in the city of Rochester. It's stuff like that. So like that project, that $1 billion is probably going to eventually fund the rest of the removal of the inner loop in Rochester, I would imagine, unless it's already earmarked for another project. I don't actually know the specifics of that, but that's the type of stuff that they have in mind. Some of which is good and it makes sense. Sometimes there are highways that really never should have been there, and they don't really make sense anymore in a lot of ways. So filling those in and connecting streets and filling it with businesses and other stuff can be a good thing if it's done in a way that allows for organic markets to crop up and exist. All right, so we're starting to run out of time on segment one here, but thanks again for joining us here on A Free Solution. Appreciate y'all being here. I'll leave your comments, and I'll be happy to address them as soon as I'm able to read them. Thanks again for joining us. We'll be back in just a few minutes. All right, you folks listening online, this isn't a live show. You can still leave your comments, though. I really appreciate it. Had to pre-record again, folks. Happens. All right, coming back in 5. All right, welcome back to A Free Solution. I'm Kevin Wilson, your host for today. Thanks again for joining us here on A Free Solution. Whether you're listening to WYSL, WACKO North, or our Facebook pages, A Free Solution, Kevin Wilson Facebook page, or Free Solution YouTube channel, Kevin Wilson, any one of those free channels, or the podcast too. We got a podcast as well, folks. Thanks again for joining us. And we're talking infrastructure today. Talking about what is in the infrastructure bill, what are things that are good, bad, ridiculous, whatever is that. Again, $1.2 trillion. You know, I'm just throwing out numbers here, billion here, billion there. You know, eventually adding up to real money. There's a whole bunch of money in there for public transit, $39 billion for public transit. Now, if I'm making the generous case for this, right? I don't necessarily want to, but if I'm looking at this and trying to say, okay, here's what these people are trying to say. We have spent a ton of money, like literally trillions of dollars on highway investment. And that is not the only way people get around. This is again, the argument that folks who are currently going to be pro spending this $39 billion are going to say this. We spent a ton of money on highway investment. And because we spent such a disproportionate amount of money on highway investment over the last, 6-7 decades, we now have a society that is wholly dependent on cars. So this is a way of shifting money back to other modes of transportation, other modes that they would say are more climate friendly and are more beneficial to the poor. And again, to be honest, I like mass transit. It doesn't necessarily need to be public. There's a lot of issues with public transportation. There's a lot of issues with, with metro lines end up getting mismanaged because of political stuff, because of extra rules, which we're going to talk about in here too. Things that make infrastructure more expensive, where it costs billions of dollars to build a mile of track. But mass transit isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you've ever lived in a big city, it's kind of nice to be able to be able to go out and just rely on a train and go out and not have to think about like what the bus schedule is, not have to think about getting in a car. When I was in college, when I was going and I wanted to hit the bars with my friends, it was nice. I knew what train was going to come. As long as I left before like 2 a.m, I knew what the bus schedule was. And even if I didn't, I know they would come every like 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the time of day it was. It's kind of a nice thing. And there ought to be ways, and we'll talk about it later, there ought to be ways where this doesn't necessarily have to be wholly owned, managed, and or subsidized by the government. So I get it. And the spending on cars, when we spend a lot of money on highway systems, we spend a lot of money on road infrastructure, it does make people deprioritize mass transit because it's so convenient and easy to get a car. Although it's very expensive to own a vehicle. I get it. But the problem with this isn't so much the spending on this stuff, where a lot of cities would love to do it. Again, a lot of people are used to driving in cars. B, it's quicker in many cases. C, it's too expensive, and we end up not getting enough infrastructure built out from investments in public transit that it becomes enough to overcome the obstacles of A and B there, of the convenience and the quickness factor. So that's a big problem there. Now there's $66 billion also being spent in passenger and freight rail. And now this is the one that kind of bugs me the most, because again, passenger rail, it's nice sometimes to take the Amtrak down to New York or whatever, right? But and I know I've had folks on the show who are huge fans of that stuff. But there is no reason why this needs to include this amount of public money. So first of all, the freight rail system, they're doing they're doing fine. Like they can run on their own. They are able to go out, get the rights to run the tracks that they want. We have a robust freight rail system, and the freight rail system is advanced enough where oftentimes like the passenger rail system runs on top of that. Which is if you ever get on an Amtrak down to New York City and you have to like you're wondering like, well, why the heck is the train just sitting here for half an hour? A lot of times it's because there's freight rail going through because they're using the freight rail lines. Now, uh, with 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 all that stuff though, like again, what that begs the question: why, if they have a robust freight rail network in place already, do we need to spend $66 billion on that? And again, a lot of that's for Biden's like kind of romantic dream of like Amtrak. He's well known for liking Amtrak trains, and he used to take the train from Delaware down to DC, which is coincidentally probably one of the only areas that's actually profitable in terms of Amtrak running back and forth. It's that corridor between like DC and New York. Only area where it actually makes sense. It might make sense in other places if the government was always poking their nose into running these operations, or just like doing an actual analysis of demand for passenger. It works in other places, even with fewer subsidies, other places around the world. Oftentimes, though, it's that when you have these projects that end up getting so caught up in government money, gets so caught up in the regulations of a particular state, and don't bother to look at where the actual demand for rail is. That's when you create a ton of problems. Like where you have projects that are a little bit more privately funded. You got some down in Florida right now. That might be a better opportunity for rail to be something that people want. Again, it's not bad. There's ways in which I like just being able to walk on a train. Although half the reason why flying a plane is inconvenient is because of the security theater of the TSA. If it weren't for that, if I could just like walk in and basically get right on my plane by only walking through a metal detector or something, and not have to take an extra, my goodness, like 2 hours getting through all the rigmarole of security, then I probably wouldn't even feel that way. It's mostly just that the getting through all that stuff with a plane I find inconvenient. I don't like it, and it doesn't actually accomplish the security goals that they claim that it does. Anyway, small tangent on that one. So you got all this money is being spent on there. A lot of it's going to be spent here in the Northeast. We'll see. Again, we'll see if there's going to be a bunch of, again, we'll quote, investment in high speed rail. If we'll get like a Buffalo to New York line or something. Who knows? I don't know if that would be useful. I kind of doubt that it would be. And if it would get enough passengers to actually justify the significant cost of this program. And again, this is less than what Biden wanted. He wanted $80 billion to Amtrak. And it's because he likes Amtrak. That's what it is. So next part of this too is the upgrade to broadband. And here's the interesting thing about this one. So the bill contains $65 billion to improve broadband infrastructure, which again, Biden initially wanted $100 billion. Which is just a ridiculous amount of money. Now, there is issues with some folks accessing broadband. I hit on this on a previous show. I think it was last Wednesday. And Tim and I, the first time I had Tim on the show, we talked about this issue too, is that there's some areas, including in New York State, where it's difficult to get high-speed internet because when private companies look at laying out lines there, if you have to lay out, I don't know, whatever, 5 miles of cable to serve a dozen houses, it doesn't scale. It doesn't make sense for those companies to do so, right? Because, well, that's a lot of fiber to lay out, a lot of stuff you have to dig out, and you will never make back your money by laying out those lines. It's just what it is. And so folks who live in rural communities, and I know we have many of them listening to this show, and this becomes a very contentious issue. They say, well, then the government ought to subsidize that. And I'm sorry, and I know this might make some people mad. I don't think so. I don't think the government should subsidize that any more than it should subsidize stuff going on in the city either. And here's why. Again, if you want to live out in the country, there are trade-offs to that. And one of those trade-offs might be is that you're not entitled to having either the government or private companies make massive investments on your behalf. You're not. You do not get to have any of my money. And this type of investment too also kind of runs counter to the supposed climate goals that the progressive want too. Because if you subsidize living out in the country, and this is what this is a subsidy for that in rural areas that don't have access to the same high speed internet, then you have people more spread out. They have to use more gas to get from place to place, and it requires more materials just to get out there. Again, not just internet, but also roads and pipes and gas and all sorts of other stuff that people want when you're living in a more remote area. And if you're going to go live out in the area and you're not on the grid, and more power to you. Love it. Great. Do your thing. I totally get it. You're going to be on well and not rely on any of the other stuff that gets subsidized by other areas. Cool. And the other part of this too is that it's going to become obsolete by the time this spending actually happens, because now we have places like SpaceX and Facebook's working on this too. There's all these companies that are building out satellite-based internet that you should be able to access anywhere in the world and still have it be pretty darn fast. And on top of that too, the Biden administration, and I'll post a link to this, the Biden administration used a measure for people who didn't have access to high-speed internet, which I get. I use it for my job. I get that's a great thing to have to be out in the workforce. But they used a measure that doesn't even make sense. They lowered the bar so it looked like more people were without high-speed internet, whereas in fact there are big chunks of the country that are served by adequate internet for most people to do most things, for you to be able to watch Netflix and do a lot of your job. Not everywhere. I get better internet in Rochester, I'm sure, than some people can get in other places because I live in a city and that process scales. All right. Thanks again for joining us here on A Free Solution. Kevin Wilson, your host for today. We'll be back in just a few minutes talking more about the infrastructure bill. Talk to you soon. Holy shit. Was I off that whole time? All right. Promise I'll come back in a second, folks. For those of you listening online, just needed to work out what may have been an audio issue. We'll find out. All right. Welcome back to A Free Solution. I'm Kevin Wilson, your host for today. Thanks again for joining us. Appreciate y'all being here. We're again on WYSL until 1 p.m. Appreciate y'all listening in today. And shout out down the line to our friends listening over at WACK out in Newark and WACK out in Newark and online. There we go. On a Free Solution to Facebook page, a Free Solution to YouTube channel, and the Kevin Wilson Facebook page and Twitter as well. That's at Kevin Wilson ROC. If you're not following me on Twitter, been less active on there lately. But anyway, we're talking infrastructure bill today. Appreciate y'all being here. We're doing a deep dive in all the stuff that's in it. We're talking about the stuff that's going on in the broadband area. Again, if you have any questions or comments, questions about that, leave them online. I'll get to them when I can. I know it stirs up some fierce commentary on this stuff, and maybe Tim and I can talk about this on the Friday show. So moving on, though, other things that are in the bill, in addition to this, there's also again investments in airports and ports and waterways, and there's this case being made about the waterway part that we need to invest in our waterways, and that's ports specifically, because if we do more dredging, we create more deep water ports, then that will resolve some of the issues with shipping containers getting locked up on the West Coast. But I gotta tell you, that's only part of it. B, there's no reason for the government to get involved here. That they already collect fees, they already have adequate capital to be able to do this. Not everything needs to be done by government. Not every single thing has to be an investment by the federal government, and it can still happen without it. I promise. People have been doing it all over for a while. It can still happen without it. They can collect enough fees, get enough capital, get the bonds they need to do dredging to make deep water ports, if that's what they want to do. It's not always a good idea. It's not always worth the cost of doing that, but they could if they wanted to. Let the markets figure it out. $7.5 billion for zero and low emission buses and ferries. Again, that's part of the public transit part too. And then $7.5 billion towards a nationwide network of plug-in electric chargers. Again, we don't need to do this. We managed to have a nationwide network of gas stations without having to get the federal government involved. Private businesses can and already do, sometimes subsidized by the state of New York and other places, they can get the charging stations put in there. And it doesn't even have to be like big stations like we do a gas station. They can be, whatever, random restaurant stores. You're starting to see them pop up all the time. It's probably going to be just a normal thing in the next 10, 15 years as electric cars become more popular to have half the parking lot taken up by these chargers. Whatever. Again, if that's where things are going to go, that's where they're going to go. But we don't always need the government to subsidize this, because I'm betting if there's a market for it and people want to be able to charge their car while going to shop at Walmart and whatnot, Walmart's going to make the investment to put those chargers in no matter what. Now, of course, if the government is giving them some money, well, of course, they're going to take it. They're going to take advantage of it. That's what businesses do. Nothing against them. That's just what they do. It's why wouldn't you? But we're going to spend $7.5 billion on that. Great. What's another few billion at this point? And so there's a bunch of other stuff. Another $65 billion to rebuild the electric grid. New power lines, expanding renewable energy. They say, it would be great if some of that went towards nuclear power, which again would be a lot cheaper if we kind of streamlined the regulations on that. Probably not going to happen. Rebuilding the electric grid, things that do need to happen, things that are I'll say this about infrastructure generally, right? Like just kind of on the grand view of roads and power lines. Those two things specifically. It's very hard. Well, roads especially. It's very hard to pass on the cost to just the users themselves. There's too much of a free rider policy. The only way to do that I can think of with roads is if you were to make everything a toll road and or track where your car is going at all times. So you're just paying for the amount of road that you're using. There are drawbacks to that, though, right? Again, I don't necessarily want the government tracking me wherever I go so that they can pay for the amount of road that I use. I it's not really feasible for me to have a toll road outside of my house. So some of these things, it's tough to do, not impossible. It's tough to do. When when folks say who will build the roads, guys, they don't mean literally who's going to build the roads. They mean who's going to pay for the roads, and does the way of paying for them make sense without the government? And you can do it. It's just more complicated and out of the scope of what most people think about with that. So I'm not against using the government to build roads. I'm not. I know some folks are going to be, Kevin's stages, whatever, guys. I don't care. I'm fine with some of it. That being said, again, with other things, with power lines, with many roads, there are ways that we can offset these issues. There are ways that we can make them less expensive to operate. There are ways in which that we can shift some of these services into the private market. Now, I want to talk about some of that now, because here's a couple of things that we can do that there would be challenges, dude. They're going to be politically unpopular, dude. But there are things that we can do to make sure that we can get the most out of the quote unquote investment in infrastructure, right? That if we're spending $1.2 trillion and that gets us X number of bridges, with some changes to the law, some changes to regulations, maybe we can get 4 or 5x the number of bridge repairs, road repairs, etc. And first of all, I do want to step back and say I don't necessarily think it makes sense to make the investment in massive new road build outs, infrastructure build outs, et cetera. And I know there's underserved areas, and I kind of made this point before, but go look up, and I've had this guy on before, from Strong Towns. Go look up their article series on the infrastructure Ponzi scheme. Basically, it goes like this. I'm going to give you the 30-second version. Is that you make these? The government decades ago made these massive investments in infrastructure, right? Roads, water lines, etc. And they told like the towns and the states that were the beneficiaries of this money, and they said, okay, like you're gonna have all this money to build this stuff, and you could build it, and then you ought to build it in a way in which you're able to fund the maintenance in the future. And so that's what they did. And they said, okay, well, we're going to build this, and it's going to be a 30-year life cycle. But once that 30-year life cycle's up, this will have brought in so much investment into our town, county, state, whatever, that it will pay for itself, and we'll have no issue paying for these roads and bridges. Well, 30 years later, they said, "Oh, shoot. Well, we don't actually have the money for this. We thought there would be more investment in this area. We thought we'd fill more businesses here, but turns out there's only like 3 places that actually stuck around and we're collecting money for, and everything else is too spread out, and we have too much infrastructure maintained for this. So, federal government, you're going to need to help us out. So they pay for the next life cycle of these roads, bridges, etc. And then same thing. Okay, but next time you got to make sure that you can pay for it yourself. Didn't happen. Again, in a position where the federal government spent a massive, massive amount of money, what it was at the time, hoping that these investments in roads and bridges would be able to pay for themselves over time. But we keep pushing it down the road, and state and local governments keep finding themselves in a position where in some places they do great, where they have to rely on either, again, the next level of government up or the federal government to bail them out and to take care of the infrastructure that they built at the encouragement of the federal government. So go read the infrastructure Ponzi scheme over in Strong Towns. I had Chuck Marone on the show, goodness, like a year and a half ago now. It was a great episode. That was, again, back when we were called Radio Free New York too. But check it out. Definitely worth listening to. All right. And I'm actually, I think I'm starting to run out of time for this segment too. So when I come back, we'll talk about some of the solutions to this. What are some of the regulations that we can have here that will improve things? They'll take our money further. And what are some other solutions that are a bit more outside the box to address our serious infrastructure issues? Again, thanks again for joining us here on A Free Solution. We're going to be back in just a few minutes. Talk to you soon. Oh man, yes. Really nervous that I totally didn't totally didn't have it together for segment 2. I didn't have the audio for that. Wish me luck. I really hope that stuff actually went out live or got recorded, because I'm recording this on Sunday night. Want to see the Chiefs Raiders game. Would like to watch that. Patrick Mahomes is on my fantasy team. Darren Waller's also on my fantasy team. I'd like to see how it's going. But all right. So I'll be back in 30 seconds. Keep doing the show. Do the final segment here. And guys, leave your comments too. If this is something I should be doing, I should just do this live, do my pre-records where y'all are able to participate, comment in, join the show. If that's something you'd be interested, leave your comments here. Tell me that you'd be interested in that. Tim and I think, are going to do that more for Fridays. And, because I kind of miss the audience feedback. I can't get those good questions in there. But all right, we're back in 5. Right, welcome back to A Free Solution. I'm Kevin Wilson, your host for today. Thanks again for joining us. We are wrapping up this show, segment 4 now. Thanks again for joining us here on WYSL and WACK out in York, and online too, wherever you're listening, or on the podcast. Gosh, there's so many ways to listen to A Free Solution. And if you miss any part of the show, again, check out the podcast, A Free Solution. Any podcasting service going to have you, go to WYSL1040.com to also listen to the recent episodes there as well. Just go to the podcast. You'll be able to see it pretty easily. We're talking about the infrastructure bill, the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, and maybe some ways in which we could do this just a smidge better. Let's talk about the regulation side of things first, though, right? So you got a couple of things that end up getting included in this bill. Things are included in just the normal process of building infrastructure that end up driving up cost significantly. So one of those things is the Davis-Bacon Act, which requires all federally funded infrastructure projects to be paid the prevailing wage, the union wage, rather than a market wage. Now, a lot of construction companies don't use union workers, and the costs end up being, a lot higher because of that. Only about 12.8% of construction workers are actually unionized. So this ends up kind of artificially limiting the supply of available labor for any particular project, and again driving it towards higher cost unionized workers. And I know if you're a union person, maybe you think that's a good thing, but again, if it's going to drive up the cost of infrastructure by 20%, then that is 20% that you are no longer going to be able to spend on other infrastructure. That is fewer bridges that you can repair. That is fewer roads that you can fix. That is fewer ports that you can update. It is so and I'm going to talk about the ports next, but it is a significant amount of money that ends up getting spent on this stuff, and we end up losing because of it. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that if they repealed that law, it would save taxpayers $1 billion a year. Significant amount of money. So the other one too is that with the port stuff, I'd already kind of made mention of the fact that we could probably just leave that to the ports themselves. They're usually locally or state managed. They collect their own fees. They're able to get bonded out. If the Port of Miami wants to do dredging to allow more deep water tankers to access their port, then that's their business. The federal government doesn't necessarily need to be doing that. And just because the federal government isn't doing it doesn't mean it's not actually happening. I can't emphasize that enough. The federal government does not need to do anything. Those things might happen on their own, and they might happen in areas that make more sense because they know the market conditions and whether or not it makes sense to dredge deeper, because they can get the more ships in, and they can pay for it and make profit off of it. That's what ought to happen. Anyhow, so some of the other stuff that ends up getting included in this bill too is the Buy America provisions, right? And again, I know it's great to be able to get stuff from suppliers in the United States, but the fact of the matter is that, if you are required to do that, it does drive up costs significantly, and it makes it so that it's harder for companies building anything, again, the ports, the roads, whatever, to get the supplies that they need to be able to do this. It artificially constrains uh raw materials and other supplies to be able to build these, and drives up the cost, which again, you drive up the cost, that means few roads, bridges, etc., that you can actually build. uh Related to that, there's kind of Jones Act type stuff that ends up getting involved in the port construction, where you have to use the American built and flag ships, and because you're doing that, again, drives up the cost of doing all that stuff. You have an artificially constrained labor supply, and you have an artificially constrained supply of ships that you're able to use. They're able to charge a premium. That means less work gets done for more money. So we take some of those things out, we're going to be able to make our dollars go further, or maybe even spend less. I don't know. That's a crazy thought, though. The other part of this is the National Environmental Policy Act reviews. These also end up taking a long time. So the so I'm gonna read from a Cato report on this. It says in 2018, NEPA required environmental impact statements took an average of 4.5 years to complete, significantly increasing both the cost and time needed to complete infrastructure projects. 4.5 years. Oh my goodness. And I know we want to have some due diligence here. We want to say, all right, we want to say, if you're going to do a big infrastructure project, how is that going to impact the place around you? We want to make sure it doesn't destroy our neighborhood, city, etc. Okay, I get that. But 4.5 years is a long time, and you have to constantly keep going back to the drawing board, hiring more professionals to redesign and to do additional work on these projects. It adds a lot of time and money, and your dollars are able to go less far, and you end up disrupting the whole community process further with that long of a timetable just to even get started. And then by the time you get started, who knows, money changes, priorities change, all sorts of stuff can disrupt that. And then suddenly you've just, again, set a big pile of money somewhere and set it on fire, or given it to professionals, depending on how nicely you want to spin it. But I'm not in favor of that. I think we need to find a way to streamline that process as much as possible and make sure that, my goodness, can we at least get it down to a year or something? That's ridiculous. 4.5 years. All right. So here's a more outside the box solutions. Some of these, I'm getting from Larry Sharp, who's great. Some of these, other stuff floating around libertarian circles. Big one is again, the government doesn't always need to do this stuff, right? The government, as I said, the federal government doesn't need to be the ones who are subsidizing, dredging the ports. Let the ports do it. The government doesn't need to be the one building rail projects. Let private companies do it if it makes sense, if there's enough passenger demand to justify an increase in capacity. With broadband, we don't need to by the time we go and lay out all this cable and we spend a massive amount of money giving internet to a handful of people who have chosen to live in more spread out areas, it's going to be obsolete anyway. We have the development of satellite-based internet technologies that are going to be high speed and perfectly adequate for doing most of the things that we want to do on the internet. You could probably even stream a podcasting show. The one that I know like drives some people nuts is actually, I don't dislike toll roads. I think toll roads are fine. I if it weren't tied to like New York State and a bunch of like political stuff there, like I actually wouldn't mind the throughway system. And some people are like, oh, Kevin, why do you want to increase fees on me? Okay, yeah, but like I only pay for it if I use it. I'd rather just do that for these major highway arteries and say, yeah, let's just completely cover the cost with user fees, and that's it. That is a better way to do things in most situations. As I acknowledged before, not always the best way to do things, but in closed access highway systems like the Thruway, it does make sense. The other thing you could do is allow more advertising space. Seriously, that's it wouldn't be that difficult to do. Out of home advertising, just have more monetization of things like of bridges. I'm fine with selling naming rights to that stuff. Allow greater monetization of overpasses and using that for ad space, using other side of the road stuff for ad space. Does not bother me in the least. And if it offsets the massive cost of highway building and we're able to get more and or better infrastructure out of it because we allow companies to be able to get their message to consumers who happen to be driving through those highways, then great. I see that as a win-win. Let's monetize that as much as possible. Use the existing infrastructure we have and let you could do things like like phone companies to use it more effectively, allowing advertisers to get out there, whether it's billboards or whatever. It doesn't even matter. Just I don't have all the ideas here. I think if you open that up, companies will take advantage of those opportunities. There's other stuff too. At the local level, things like zoning reform, I'm always going to be a fan of. But if you have any other ideas for this stuff, if you have other ways in which we can make sure that infrastructure is affordable, more easily built, or scaled right? Again, it doesn't even have to be building more stuff, it's just scaled appropriately. Let us know. Thanks again for joining us here on A Free Solution. I will be back on Wednesday. Appreciate you. Take care.